Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack. There has been a marked increase in the amount of people that are in jail. In 1970, there were right around 300,000 people in prisons in the United States. Currently, we are over 3 million in prisons. This marked increase within prisons has been a debilitating aspect of many parts of our lives, including, the taxes that it takes to run prisons, as well as on the families of the folks that are within prison. Many of the people who are in prison today are in there for nonviolent reasons. Many of them are addicts. Many of them have mental health diagnoses. There are a number of reasons that a person ends up in jail, not all of which are because they are violent criminals. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So what do you think about that? Why would there be such a marked increase in the amount of people that are in jail these days?
Good morning, Joe. Well, one of the things, the primary reason for the market increase today stems back almost about 30 or 40 years ago, as the laws for crimes were changed and altered. If you go back to the 70s and the late 70s, the 70s, and the 80s, crimes were changed. Crimes took place, but the laws were changed, and the way they were implemented changed. For instance, in New York City, an African American could be arrested for crack, 1 gram of crack, and go to prison and serve 10 years.
Right.
An individual in California could be arrested for cocaine and serve 6 months probation. Crack, cocaine,
Yeah.
They don't even compare, but yet the legal system penalized African Americans more harshly in the penal system, and so you get a high volume. When you start racking up crimes like that, you get a high volume. And you look at the city, New York City, you look at Los Angeles, you look at Detroit, you look at places, urban areas where people of color are in concentration. You have a high volume of people of color that are entering the legal system and as well into the penal system.
Well, my guest today is Greg Johnson, Reverend Dr. Greg Johnson. He is the pastor at Cornerstone Community Church, and you've been involved with the Cornerstone group for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've been actively in existence for the last 5 years. The Cornerstone group started during the celebration of the Freedom Riders anniversary, and a group of people came through that experience and felt like that we needed to do something in our community to help people who are coming out of prison, to give them a fighting chance and allow them to have a network of support that will enable them to succeed.
Now, how many people are on that committee?
It varies. We have a group of people from organizations like the YWCA. We have the Fairfield. We have people who are represented from the VOA, and church members are part of that group as well. So it's a very ecumenical group of people.
And the goal of it is to help educate, and as well as educate the community, as well as help people who have been in prison.
Yes.
Re-enter.
Yes. Yes.
So how many people have you helped over the course of the 5 years?
Well, Cornerstone had established, this is about 3 years ago, we established a coaching program for persons coming out of prison, the federal prisons, and they are designated to return here to Broome County. The coaching program we established serves individuals, and we've served probably over the past 3 years, probably about 30 people. And coaches are trained by the New York State Department of Community Services, Justice and Community Services, and we're the only organization in the state of New York that is trained to do this type of work.
And it would seem like that mentoring process is really important then.
It is, because when people, especially persons who've served an extended amount of time, come back to a community, one that they may not be familiar with, or a community where they had been arrested for the crime that they committed, it's challenging for them to be grounded and pointed in the right direction when they are faced with the same things that sent them to prison. So the mentoring program helps them to begin looking at life differently, asking questions differently, and working in such a way that they begin to put together a life that they want.
Now, you had indicated that one of the reasons that people have harsh penalties, and many of them, and the data is staggering when you start looking at it through the lens of race. Just the amount of African American people in comparison to others who are in jail. I mean, where, you know, in the majority of our population, I think African Americans is right around 25% of the population.
I'm not sure, but it's a small percentage compared to white America.
But then it reverses itself within the prison system.
Yeah.
So in the prison system, you end up with the majority, a large percentage of them are African American.
Well, I would say people of color, and you look at people of color being African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, and so you have the black and brown community largely represented in the penal system, and basically for crimes that persons of a different ethnicity would not be penalized for.
In your estimation, is there an element of poverty that would be at play within this? So that the folks who use cocaine, so to speak, you know, you're using the differentiation that you brought up between cocaine and crack. Folks who use cocaine, would they have access to greater legal representation and other kinds of things that would keep them out of the penal system?
To a degree, yes.
Versus others?
To a degree, yes. And that brings up the issue of how the bail is set, retention is used for returning to trial. But yeah, that is a huge element in it, in the penal system and how people are retained.
And would also indicate too, so when bail is set, and people who can afford bail tend to only have a very short jail term before they're sentenced or other kinds of things like that, whereas folks who don't have access to the capital necessary to post bail, or the house, or own a house, or, you know, other kinds of things that might be used to post bail, those folks would end up having to stay within jail for up until the time of their trial, and then lose their job, lose their apartment, maybe even wreck their family structures and other kinds of stuff. So it seems like it's equally unfair on that end of it, as well as within the jail. So how do you react to that?
It's a travesty in our country where we still have to combat in the justice system discrimination.
Right.
Because it is discriminatory practices. I believe there were findings early in the 80s that showed that there was no standard for bail. Bail could be set for a person in Detroit or New York in the urban settings a whole lot differently from someone who came from a suburban setting.
Right.
So you have a higher bail for people of color and one that is manageable for people who are of a different ethnicity. And that discriminatory practice is right in the justice system itself.
That seems to be a recurring theme. There was a book that I know that you've read too, called The New Jim Crow, which was a real in-depth look at the jail system and the prison system within our country and how sentencing is brought down on people. And it was kind of an eye-opening thing to relate the current prison system to the issue of Jim Crow, which was something that occurred back in, before 1950, whatever, when it was outlawed. So what do you think about that idea?
I think it's a very relative term. And as I was thinking about our justice system, as I was thinking about our society, there are people who are asleep, Joe. And when you talk about discrimination, they're like, no, this isn't happening, and it's really impossible for it to happen in the justice system. They're asleep. Then there are those who are actively aware of what's going on in the justice system and are not doing anything about it, and they're very compliant. So that there's a group of people who are compliant with the new Jim Crow, if you will.
Right.
And then there's a group of people who are actively engaged and vocal about this discrimination in the legal system. So you have three group of people that are involved. Those who are asleep, they're involved. They may not be aware of it or want to be aware of it, but they're actively involved or inactively involved because they're not exposing themselves to this and may think, well, this is not my problem. You mentioned the taxes that go into the penal system. I don't remember exactly what year it was, but subcontractors used for the penal system. Many of them went on the New York Stock Exchange, their companies, and so you have big corporations making profit off of the penal system. And looking at that, that's no different. That is no different when you look at how African Americans were used in slavery in the early 19th century. So companies, corporations, and the country was built on the backs of African Americans. And so what's the big difference there? Modernization.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I read a book when I was in college, actually, and I still remember a line from it. It was the writer was Bill Pennell, and Bill wrote in his book. He said, we no longer own slaves; we rent them. And it seems to me that that's kind of indicative of what you were talking about, as far as because the folks that are in the prison system, they give very cheap labor. They have to pay them something, but they end up the majority of the money or the capital they help produce goes back to the corporation. And the corporation then has access to all kinds of collateral that built on the backs of people that they've been renting.
Yep. So incarceration works for the wealthy.
It does. It really does.
And it really hinders the social aspect of our country. The challenging thing today is the voices of people who are trying to bring awareness to this discrimination in the legal system is few. And I like to see those voices become many, more, and especially our churches, black, white, need to be vocal in becoming, first of all, aware of the discrimination, and then secondly, being vocal about how we feel about this discrimination, because it is our responsibility as people of God to be actively engaged in making this current world a better place, not for some, but for everybody.
For everybody, exactly. My guest today is Greg Johnson from the Cornerstone Group, also Cornerstone Community Church, which is in Endicott on the corner of Lincoln Avenue and Main Street in Endicott. It's good to have you on Encounter. And so let's shift our thinking a little bit, because this show is airing on Pentecost Sunday. So it seems to me as if Pentecost would have something to say to the situation that we're looking at as far as the jail is concerned.
It has a lot to say. I think when we look at Pentecost, the event of Pentecost throws open the doors for everyone to be actively engaged in social change. You look at the book of Acts and the power of the Holy Spirit coming down and working with the apostles at that time, where they could speak to people from varied nationalities. They weren't just speaking to the Jews. They weren't just speaking to the Greeks. They were speaking to people of a variety of nationalities, where everyone was able to understand what was going on and what they were talking about. And I believe that is the opportunity for the church today, to speak to a variety of people using the message of the gospel, the message of the gospel that we are to love everybody, and our mandate is to treat everybody with love and respect. And so Pentecost shows us that when we are doing that, we throw open the doors of the church, not to intimidate, not to convict, but to care for the souls of all.
And it's so interesting that Paul and Silas were often in jail. It would seem to me as if, and there was that whole aspect of, where they were in jail and the doors were flung open and there was freedom, and the jailer thought that his life was ending, and he comes on them and they said, we're still here. Don't worry about it. Your life's not going to end. It's funny that in a way it almost seems like that's where we're at today. The idea is that